anger on the streets of Chinese cities. The biggest nationwide display of discontent this tightly controlled country has seen in a generation. Protesters pushing back against police and the government's zero COVID policy. The unrest triggered by a deadly fire in Urumqi, in China's western Xinjiang region last Thursday. Videos emerge of fire hoses barely reaching the blaze, which killed at least 10 people. Among them, Kamarnisa Han Abdulrahman and 4 of her children. What happened to your mother and your brothers and sisters?
The fire started on the 15th floor. The smoke poisoned my family. The government could not stop the fire in time.
2 surviving adult children of Kamarnisa Han speak to me from Turkey. Unable to see their family since 2017 due to the harsh crackdown, the government accused of putting up to 2 million of their fellow ethnic Uyghurs and members of other minorities in internment camps. They say their loved ones were trapped in the building by COVID measures.
They could not escape because the fire escape was blocked, and the fire escape to the roof of the building was also locked.
Accusations CNN cannot independently confirm, but Chinese authorities have been seen literally locking residents into buildings. Outrage over the Urumqi fire compounded by previous deadly incidents in recent months directly linked to COVID prevention. Though CNN verified 16 protests in 11 Chinese cities this weekend, a Chinese government official told a journalist they just didn't happen.
What you mentioned does not reflect what actually happened. China has been following the dynamic zero COVID policy and has been making adjustments based on realities on the ground.
On Monday, the white papers that have become a symbol of the protests in mainland China spread here to Hong Kong, where these small groups of demonstrators are holding a vigil for what they say are the victims of China's zero COVID policy.
I am a victim. I cannot go home for many years, like 2 to 3 years, right? My parents were locked down for 3 months, and even relatives of my good friends, they suicide because of the lockdowns.
With China reporting record-breaking new daily cases of COVID, there appears to be no end to the lockdowns in sight. Meanwhile, siblings Mohammed and Sharapat cannot even pray for closure after suffering the unimaginable loss of 5 immediate members of their family. Will you go home for the funeral of your family?
We want to attend the funeral of our family members, but if we went back now, China will put us in jail or even torture us.
Ivan Watson, CNN, Hong Kong.
Yeah, such a heartbreaking story there. And like Ivan just said, these protests have been happening amid record new COVID infections in China over the past few days, and that's despite lockdowns and mandatory mass testing. On Monday, China reported more than 38,000 cases. Now, the number, while it's of course high for China, it breaks the streak of 6 consecutive days of record highs. Joining me now is Dr. Jorge Rodriguez, a board-certified internal medicine specialist and viral researcher, and he joins me now from Los Angeles. It is good to see you again, and I wish we weren't speaking about really such a vulnerable part of the world that is still so vulnerable to this virus. You know, I have to say, it seems like for China, time has stood still here, right? I mean, what options does it have, especially given how vulnerable its population is with the lack of vaccines?
Well, I think you make a great point. In China, they're trying to make time stand still, but time is moving forward and the virus is moving forward. So they don't have many options because China has relied on just this very totalitarian type of blockade, if you will. You know, but the virus has changed. Omicron changed the whole thing by becoming so resistant. And unfortunately, China does not have a good plan B. They don't have a good vaccine. You know, if they're going to do something mandatory, they should probably have their people have a mandatory vaccine. So I think this horse is out of the barn. And the fact that they're having these many tens of thousands of infections now mean that the zero tolerance, the zero availability of people to get out of their homes is already a very failed tactic.
And yet, what do they do now? You know, Dr. Anthony Fauci was on CNN on Monday. He'd offered his thoughts and was quite candid about the fact that as a scientist, it was hard to keep one step ahead of this virus. I want you to listen now to what he said about the Chinese situation.
When you're talking about shutting things down, it should always be a temporary phenomenon, not a long-range strategy, but you should do it with a purpose in mind to allow you to open.
In terms of allowing to open, what can China do, even if they wanted to, you know, pull back a little bit from COVID zero policy, given the fact that vaccination levels are so low?
Well, that's why I think they're between a rock and a hard place, because they really don't have that. They need to bring in good vaccines into the country. Now, this is one of the most populous countries in the world, so it's going to be very difficult to do. And I think that part of the reason that they are resorting to these zero COVID policies is because they may not have the financial means to bring really good vaccines. So I think they're going to be in a very difficult situation, because the fact that they're already having tens of thousands of cases per day, these are going to continue to increase exponentially. So I don't have an answer to that, but I think they may have to reach out diplomatically and try to seek help, you know, from the rest of the world that do have mRNA vaccines, that do have better ways of protecting their people.
Yeah, and the rest of the world has already said that it is there to help if China asks for it. It hasn't so far. I want to go through what was really a chilling assessment earlier this year. It was published in Nature Medicine in May, and it was really trying to spell out what an Omicron wave would mean for China. And this is just the conclusion. After a lot of research, we find that the level of immunity induced by the March 2022 vaccination campaign would be insufficient to prevent an Omicron wave that would result in exceeding critical care capacity. Let's underscore that. Exceeding critical care capacity with a projected intensive care unit peak of 15.6 times the existing capacity and causing approximately 1.55 million deaths. I mean, Doctor, where do you go from that kind of stat? Vaccination rates haven't moved that much. How alarming is that when you look at the consequences for 1.4 billion people?
Well, it's very alarming, not just for those 1.4 billion people, but the fact that you're going to have 1.4 billion people that even a small fraction of that are going to be reproducing new viruses and will affect the rest of the world. And the world has to wake up to the fact that maybe the way China goes with a new wave of infections is the way that the world may go. So really, this is going to need to be a concerted effort. If China is going to use totalitarian tactics to try to prevent the spread of COVID, they should use, and I'm not advocating totalitarian anything, don't get me wrong, but they should use at least, you know, something that works. And the only thing that is working now to some degree to decrease the spread, to decrease the deaths are mRNA vaccines. And that's where I think they need to head. They need to, you know, seek help from the rest of the world. They need to sort of humble themselves and seek external help.
And unfortunately, it is unlikely they will do that. And I want to drill down a little bit more on the consequence you were just talking about. I mean, 1.4 billion people, if COVID does get to a point where it's uncontrollable there are consequences for the rest of the world, just in terms of the way viruses behave, right?
Of course. And that's my whole point. Listen, we're not isolated. And that's why from the beginning, the way of treating COVID was doomed, because there was no concerted effort with the whole world. You can't just treat it in the United States. You can't just treat it in the UK. We are completely united by transportation, by immigration, by economics. So that's what's been lacking. And maybe the WHO didn't do enough, but we can't just blame it on the WHO. If every country is not going to cooperate and realize that we are all in this together, we are going to be where we are. And unfortunately, I think we're too lackadaisical nowadays, and we've taken it for granted because people are not dying as much. So what's next? That super virus that is just going to completely obliterate a great portion of the world? It may happen. And China is a 1.4 billion petri dish possibility.
Yeah, chilling when you put it in those terms. Again, the unfinished business still of this pandemic. Dr. Jorge Rodriguez, thank you again.